Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Nikki Barua. Nikki is a serial entrepreneur, a keynote speaker, a best-selling author, and she's leading the movement to make people exponentially capable in the AI age. Nikki, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Krish. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm super excited. We had a quick chat before we hit record, so we have an idea, at least I have an idea as to what I want to get started with here. But before we do that, Nikki, if you could just introduce yourself to our audience, like who you are, what
Yeah.
you do, and then after that, we can jump into the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the through line of my story has been all about reinvention, from whether I was coming to America as an immigrant from India to building my career in corporate strategy and digital transformation to becoming an entrepreneur and building multiple businesses that have all been in the business of making elephants run. I've helped some of the world's largest companies reinvent themselves and become more agile and innovative. And today I'm thrilled to take all of those experiences and lead Flipwork, which is focused on helping companies prepare for the AI age and really reinvent how their people think, work, and collaborate.
Lovely. One of the things you said before we before I hit record was you said your experience, at least recently or perhaps for a long time, has been with enterprise companies, with large companies. I
Yeah.
used to work for big companies in my past life, but most of my many recent years have been working either for myself at Snowpal or for other small organizations. So there's plenty I want to learn from you during the course of the next 45 minutes to an hour. So thank you for that introduction. So the topic that we've loosely chosen is the need for companies to fundamentally reinvent and not transform, right? I'm just quoting that almost verbatim from what you said. And I think it's a very interesting topic. And we are at a point of inflection, if you will, in my opinion, where things are changing. So when you said that, my eyes lit up because I'm like, you know what? I want to hear everything you have to say about that. So we'll dig as deep as we can. But just by way of quickly introducing that topic, Nikki, what might you say? When you say the need for companies to fundamentally reinvent and specifically not to transform,
Mhm.
what are the differences between reinvention and transformation?
Yeah, great question, because that is a fundamental difference that leaders and businesses have to understand, which is transformation is not a new concept. Businesses have been transforming for decades because every time there is some sort of disruptive technology or a shift in the market, you transform. So whether it is traditional businesses adding on an e-commerce capability, or building a mobile app, or shifting, their content and data to the cloud. Each of those is some sort of transformation and capability, and it tends to be evolutionary in nature. And because it's evolutionary, it's slower, it is episodic, there's a start and end to that initiative. Reinvention is completely different. Reinvention isn't just about adding some new capability or entering new markets or just getting better, doing things better. Reinvention is completely reimagining who you are and what business even that you're in. And that's why it's revolutionary in nature. And because it's revolutionary, it cannot just be episodic where you have a project start date and end date. It requires continuous, innovation over and over again. And in practical terms, what does that mean for a business? It means you have to literally gut the business from the top down, inside out, and rethink your business model, your competitive mode, your strategy, your operating agility, your people and culture, all of that. That is not an easy undertaking. And it's not just about the complexity of making it happen. What the real challenge is the leadership courage it requires to take on a risk of that magnitude.
Okay, so let me give you a random example here to ask my next question, right? If I were to ask my wife, what are some of the things that she would like to see change in me? She would go the revolutionary route, like you mentioned, as opposed to evolutionary. She's going to list like a 40 different things. Sure, understood. But
Yeah.
the practicality is like you cannot change 40 things overnight. You're going to have to change one at a time, right? And again, I give a random social personal example. But if you took a more professional example, there are a lot more bottlenecks there because a company is in the business of making money. And whether they like it or not, whether somebody else likes it or not, they've been hopefully making some money or a lot of money. And even
Mhm.
if the future is going to hold something very differently, and if you were to go and tell them, hey, Krish, you guys are doing things not so correctly, at least not keeping in tune with the times, change every single thing that you're doing, my initial reaction would be, that doesn't make any sense, right? So,
Yeah.
how do we, where do we start, and where do you start your conversations with these organizations?
Yeah, you hit on exactly the biggest issue that leaders face, because executives are under a lot of pressure to reinvent. They're getting that pressure from the boards, from the market, and all of that stuff. The most typical reaction tends to be inertia, because they don't know where to begin. It's not because they necessarily aren't bought into the need for reinvention, it's because it's overwhelming. You can't change 40 things overnight. Where do you even begin? And that's why in our process in working with them, the first thing we do is actually an assessment to determine where is the highest ROI and where's the right focus. And either that is in from the perspective of the highest opportunity, like where is the market opportunity, where if you double down and focus on just that, you are positioning yourself from a place of strength, or removing the biggest roadblock that is holding you back and is actually going to like crush you in the market, whether that is releasing efficiencies and whatnot. But really identifying the focus areas first. It's almost like, knowing your North Star. You can change everything, but you got to know what is the North Star and the direction in which you want to go. From there, we work them through 90-day sprints and really making the big problem smaller. Right? You're not going to go embark on a 10-year reinvention. You have to start with something that starts to yield results faster, starts to build that real internal confidence and belief that this is going somewhere. We're starting to see the results, that yes, this change is worth the effort and the investment and all of that. And doing it in 90-day sprints starts to build, not just yield the results, but what it really does is builds the experimental muscle culturally, that much like any agile sprint, right? Like you start to kind of see that, and so now there's a little bit more excitement and belief and all of that. And doing that repeatedly is what starts to yield the discovery of what is your ultimate like strategic differentiation. Because when everyone has access to the same kind of infinite intelligence, what becomes your differentiation? And that is like one of the areas that strategically executives and CEOs are struggling.
It's very interesting. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate for the most part, right? I typically do that on the podcast, not because I don't agree. I'm going to intentionally try to take a contrarian point of view, just to explore that side, if you will. So with that being said, say I'm trying to come up with an example. Let's go to an engineering example, but I want to go with a sillier example before I go to an engineering example. Let's say someone comes into my house and I want to remodel my house or do some, I don't know, interior design and whatnot. uh, Somebody comes in, they know a whole lot about this, a whole lot more than I do. So they like, Krish, you know what, you're gonna have to change every room in your house, and in each of these rooms, things have to change dramatically, and collectively, things are gonna look a whole lot more beautiful. Now, I would never doubt them for a second because they're experts in that space, and I had a need for change, which is why I brought them into the house, and they are offering their opinions. But the natural next instinct is going to be, I don't have the budget to pay you for every room. So let's start with one room and then let's go to the other rooms. And even within that room, how much of that change, what should the change really be? Are you going to change, my desk in the office room to completely something else, or should we do incrementally? The reason I come up with this as an example, Nikki, is the intention is one thing, right? You have good intent. Both parties in this case have good intent. I call the designer, they came into the house. But when you bring dollars and everything else into the mix, and timelines and deadlines, the intent and what you can execute on tries to, they diverge, right? Even unintentionally so. And if they start diverging and you're trying to then do it slowly and but surely, would you have not come into the house with the revolutionary intent, but 3 months down the road you ended up doing something evolutionary because you were not given the power to actually do what you intended to do? I mean, does what I'm
Yeah.
asking you make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Well, a couple of things about that. First of all, because of the revolution nature of this, um, you can't do this unless you are working at the highest levels. Like, this is not the kind of change you can deploy coming in at a director level of a company. It has to be at the highest level, right? And so the power part of, are you empowered to drive that change, If that's not in place, none of this even takes up. Right off the bat, that is to do this kind of revolutionary change, because you're not going to have someone who's like director of engineering or director of marketing coming in and saying, let's radically reinvent everything and take major risks that might cause our business, a public company to get in trouble. So it is very much a CEO and a board conversation. And it is done with the clarity of recognizing not just the need for it, but more importantly, the upside of getting this done. So there's clarity on sort of the business case for it. And that's where the power part of it is in place. The other part is the execution cycles, and does it end up being evolutionary because you're taking a big problem and doing it in small bits and evolutionary wise. Part of what yields that, in using your house remodeling example, when you remodel a part of the house or one room of the house, you're not actually increasing the value of the house overall until the full house is done. What's different in this is that we're seeing 8 to 10x return within the 90-day cycle for the investment they make for the 90-day cycle. So you're also getting a return that is, again, reinvested back into the business. So it's not necessarily you're just like paying for things that are, that will take years to see any kind of results. And therefore, suddenly, before you know it, there's less energy, there's less commitment, there's less funding, and now you've ended up in an evolutionary state instead of revolutionary state. That's why the choice of where you start, who is first involved in those initial sprints, to which use cases you focus on and identify, and what areas you start to reinvent, each of those decisions becomes really pivotal in not only getting to the right results, but getting to faster results. And then continuing to demonstrate that return that reinforces the commitment at the executive level.
Makes complete sense. I'm going to stick to the same example till you tell me, Krish, this doesn't make sense anymore and we can get to a different example. But going with the same, let's say you come in as a designer. There's many rooms in the house. How do you pick which room to start with? I mean, let me step back actually. There's two ways at least to go about this. There's many ways, but I would say two very uniquely different ways. One is you go to each of the rooms, you make do an assessment, and then say that this is the best room to get started with. Let me work on that room, get it done, showcase that, and if things go well, we'll take that as an example and extrapolate that to the other rooms in the house. That's one approach. The second approach is the exact opposite in some ways, which is I want to make the same change, a smaller change in every room in that same house, and see if that change scales to every room. Because by going with the approach of doing everything to one room, that room may have been a kitchen, could have been a bathroom, could have been an office room, and maybe it was more receptive to all kinds of changes that were being made to it. But while you took that same set of changes to other rooms, it did not actually scale or may not have even made sense. So do these two approaches, I mean, I'm sure there's others as well you can fill in there. How do you go about doing this?
So it's the approach that we've seen in practical terms work better is picking a room rather than the same change across all rooms, and building upon that. And the reason for that is, while there are similarities across different divisions of business units or functional areas, there are also enough nuances, as well as the reality of politics and business leader opinions and differences in style and all those kind of things. Their operating intensity might be different. The intensity of a sales team versus, let's say, the HR team. They're two very different cycles and different types of cultures within that. There's for a very large company, there's mini cultures all over the place, right? So it's not one size fits all where you can say, let's just do the painting of every room first, and then we'll come in, so there's, in some ways, they're almost different startups all under one big house. So that's why picking each one and looking at what does that need and how do you reinvent that portion, make it successful, and then see what parts of it culturally translate into other rooms, if you will, that you take that as learnings that you incorporate, but not necessarily one size fits all.
Okay. So let's say you came into the house, you looked at a bunch of rooms, you picked the one that made the most sense to you to showcase the way things could potentially change, not incrementally. but dramatically, right? Revolutionary, in a revolutionary way. Now, you picked the room because that satisfied a bunch of the criteria that you were looking for. Let me ask you if there could be a conflict of interest here, because if the designer came in, they know
Mhm.
in my assumption here, I'm being presumptive here, but humor me for a second. They're going to pick the room that's not the largest of the rooms, or maybe not the most complex of the rooms. Maybe one that they can use to showcase the value that they bring to the table, believing what they know and also believing what the room presents in terms of challenges.
Mhm.
But from the house owner, the homeowner standpoint, they might want a different room because you may have picked the easiest of the rooms, quote unquote,
Mhm.
or the ones that do not fit their criteria, to know if Nikki changed this, that this can
Mhm.
scale to other rooms. So how do you come to, I mean, is there a conflict of interest here at all to begin with, or how do you go about that part of the problem?
No, I think there's enough foundational data and insights that are drawn from the initial diagnostic that we do. That's why that is so valuable. Instead of just being opinions of my opinion versus the CEO's opinion of which room to pick, it's not opinion based. It tends to be based on like the assessment at an individual employee level, the leadership level, and insights that are drawn from the diagnostic assessment that we do that evaluates all kinds of 35 different aspects of this reinvention that then not only reveals things that are unique to that company, but also helps to benchmark against other companies to see where are some patterns emerging from that. And that becomes a really valuable tool to have a more rational dialogue with the client to say, okay, here's what it's revealing. Now let's talk about are there other things beyond just this data that might drive your preference? Because you have to recognize that at the highest levels, the executives may have visibility to things that nobody else might. It could be things that are highly confidential that you don't know that might be driving their choice of the room. And you have to go with whatever that makes sense. But it's not, the starting point is not opinions. The starting point is the diagnostic that gives a baseline view of where the opportunities lie and which room to take.
Okay, I'm going to go from the example of a house in a room to the exact opposite end of that spectrum, to a much larger company. And I'm
Yeah.
going to pick one for no other reason, but because it's one of my favorite companies. Let's start with Alphabet. I'm a
Yeah.
huge fan of Sundar Pichai, and I promise it's not because he speaks the
From
same
your
language that I
hometown.
do. No, 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 it's not that. And I had the privilege of running into him a couple of times in DC, actually, so it was very exciting.
Yeah.
So let me quote what you said something earlier that was very interesting. You said this needs to be top down, coming from the highest levels of the organization because of the size of this impact and the magnitude of the impact as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'll quote this, I'll paraphrase, I should say. In one of the earnings calls, like maybe 3 quarters when Google was half the size that they are now, which is not all that long ago, probably like 6 months ago, uh, they were punished by Wall Street after they reported earnings because Sundar Pichai had said they're going to spend a lot more money on AI and the capex numbers were going much higher. And one of the things he said, to paraphrase that, if my memory serves me right, was he said the risk of over investing on AI was lower than the risk of under investing in AI, for instance, right? So we'll come to that in a second, but I want to call out for that for a specific reason. So let's say we take Alphabet as a company, and they have many different companies under the parent company,
Mhm.
right? They have YouTube, they have Waymo, they have Google, the Google search and everything else. What else? They have Google Cloud, the CEO being a
Mhm.
different person, right? I think it's Thomas Kurian. So they have so many larger organizations, like monstrous organizations within their $4 trillion umbrella. Now I'm going from this little house and to this large world out there, to the second largest company in the world. The problems and the solutions we discussed so far, Nikki, let's start at the 50,000 foot level and dig a little bit deeper. How would you start? Do you start at, hey, let's focus on YouTube versus Google Cloud versus Waymo? Would that be the room in our example? I have more questions, but from a starting point, would that be the room analogy?
Well, in holding companies of that kind, it typically is more of a distributed decision. It's not going to be Sundar deciding. It may be more of a commitment to say, yes, we got to do that. But ultimately, the operationalizing that decision is still going to be on independent CEOs within each of those businesses. And so the rooms are one level down below that. So if it is YouTube, the YouTube CEO is going to decide like which part of YouTube do you start with, rather than Sundar deciding where in YouTube, or do I pick YouTube versus Waymo, right? And I think for a lot of the very large organizations that have multiple brands or multiple different businesses within that, that's what we typically would expect to see.
So
But
which means you, sorry,
going
go ahead.
back
Yep.
to like Sundar's, comment about under investing versus over investing in AI and the risk within that, and that's typically where the point is that it's less about like, am I other than the really progressive companies, and we certainly see this more within tech CEOs that are like, get it, they're ready, they know you can't afford to be slow or behind and all of that. For most of the traditional industries, particularly the more legacy industries, if you will, there's awareness of like needing to get started and needing to invest and doing all of that stuff. But there's also the dilemma of just, what part of your very sort of robust traditional business do you take a risk with? And for them, like having that clarity of knowing the room helps to break the inertia. It's less so about where you land. It's more about getting out of that state of inertia of not even taking one step forward.
Okay. So let's say, I took the example of this largest tech company that's driving the direction of a lot of the things we're
Yeah,
talking about. May or may not be the best example, but if we had to pick a company, I want to dig deeper into the notion of not the organic change, but the more dramatic changes, right,
yeah,
Nikki? So if you could help me with a company that most people understand, it doesn't matter which industry it is in, what would
yeah,
be a company that we could take to sort of dissect this, the rooms versus how do you make these changes? I want to
yeah,
dig a little bit deeper into it, but what would be a decent example of a company that you think we can take that's big enough, that
yeah.
people know enough, and then that's good, isn't good enough as an example here?
I mean, use any company with like, I don't know, 20, 30,000 employees, right? Of that is like a public company that is let's take a financial services, a bank or something like that, right? Their a lot of their challenges are really between like the core business that is sacred, and then the supporting functions that facilitate all. And so within that, the question is, which one do you hit first? And, do you go with the supporting functions that you can drive more efficiencies and like release more capacity and like make far more faster and more efficient? Or do you strike the core functions where it's literally like, it's the scariest part for them to do, right? Like take investments, the chief investment officer. Are you willing to like have them rethink and revisit everything that they do in the investment process, or do you start with the support functions that are less risky in a way?
Okay, so that's a great example. I think it's very contextual too, because of two reasons. One is, I mentioned to you before we started recording that we're working on a fintech API. So we've been spending, some of us at the company at Snowpile, we've been spending a lot of time on in the market, but also because, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citicorp, and what is the other one? Bank of America, they all reported earnings between yesterday and today, right? So it's not a bad time to have this conversation because you mentioned financial companies. So let's take any of them. What would
Yeah,
be, it doesn't matter which one, what are some of the things that they are doing that would have changed organically or incrementally in the past, and you see that that's not a viable alternative anymore, that they're going to have to change at a much more rapid pace and be more revolutionary? Any of these companies, it's all right, but just we can
yeah,
go get to an example around it, then we can talk further about it.
yeah. I mean, the traditional approach has been about introducing technology usage. Right? You take any kind of capability that they introduce within any of the functions to say, oh, this is how we're now doing employee training, or this is how we're handling, our product development process and all of that. It's slowly introducing technology and doing the slow transformation. I mean, the typical digital transformation process that they're doing. What is happening now is the number of licenses that have been deployed and tools that have been introduced that is getting very low adoption. And without naming specific companies, because I can't get into that, but the internal discovery of saying, oh my gosh, all of the investment in technology is sitting there because the adoption isn't gated because people are afraid or are not excited about it. It's because you're trying to fit in revolutionary tools into old ways of working. Unless you fundamentally rethink, how do I go about doing the same job and figure out not only a new process for it, but introducing where that new technology or that new tool fits in, you're not going to change the work that you do. So um, we're working with a large financial services organization where one of their biggest challenge is the usage of AI tools is limited to just as a like to write email scripts or like meeting notes. It's very superficial application versus really thinking about how might this actually release capacity for people to move into higher value work. And so much of that is coming down to just the identity shift that is required for someone who draws their sense of value and their power from the identity of how they've done their work in the past. And trying to do that at large scale is not an easy initiative. And that's why part of the reason going like room by room, what it helps is it almost becomes like a gamified experience, like a leaderboard sort of thing of like seeing, hey, this team was able to do this and they saw this transformative effect. They're much faster. They've been able to double their throughput or double their output without adding any additional headcount. And because of that, they are doing much better than a different department. Creating that kind of environment starts to move the needle on it, but doing it like large scale across the whole company is not only viewed as dangerous, but also not something that they know that they can predict the results on.
Okay. So let's say going one step deeper in there. Let's say you go to a company. I'm going to take Snowpal as an example. Just going to assume that we are a whole lot larger. Hopefully one day we will be, but at this point we are smaller. But let's say we're going to extrapolate what we do, because what we do is a minuscule representation of just about everything that happens in a very large software company, right? There's no difference. I'll be honest with you. So let's
Yeah.
say you come to a company that is building software. There's many divisions and departments within that organization. So you have to figure out what needs to improve here. So my very first question is, how does that process typically work? Do I say, hey, Nikki, here are the things that we do, and here are the list of challenges that we've had in the last 6 months to a year. Now you go get started, right? That's one way to start that conversation. Or would you rather we let you be in the dark and you come and figure out what we do, what we're doing well, what we're doing not so well, and what we're doing extremely poorly, so we don't impose our bias on you in making your determinations and judgments and recommendations, but let you do the discovery yourself.
Yeah, so that's interesting. The assumption in that scenario, though, is that the outside expert knows better and is coming in to deploy that. And that's the exact opposite of how we do it. And the approach we're taking is sort of almost treating it like a capstone project for teams to go through. So what the 90-day sprints, what it really entails is that every week, the leader and, we limit it to about like 4 of their team members that join it as part of this process. Every week, they deploy the master specific reinvention strategies and they actually put it into action. And they identify like the key use cases that they believe will yield the best results. So there's a hypothesis there that we think this is this part of our process is the one that if we could double our efficiency in it, or we could improve quality in it, or there's some sort of, they have the business knowledge of what they think they can improve the most. And so starting with that use case, they go through the step by step every week of deploying the changes and identifying exactly where the improvement areas are, and they're testing and learning as they go. So it's almost like product development where they have an MVP and they kind of make some tweaks, they see what the impact is, they start to test that out, and by the end of the 90 days, what you start to see is not only their own discovery of a completely reimagined workflow, but also the team norms and the collaboration around that. Because it's not just, this is not about just pure efficiencies. A large part of this is the rewiring of the individual's thinking, behaviors, and mindsets, and how the team norms and the collaboration and the communication works. What we have found is that is the bigger change to do, because frankly, the workflows, you could have an AI agent come in and like map that out and do the current state, future state, here's efficiencies, plug in the tools and all of that. That's not what's driving the change. The change is entirely on the human side of the equation. And that's why the experience of what they go through in the 90 days is what yields more of the results than the actual change, which is very different from a big four consulting company coming in and saying, oh, we're the experts. We know exactly what to come in and change. It's Snowpal. Here, you've been doing everything wrong. Here's the new method. Go follow this and you're done. Right? So that's why it's, while the sponsorship and the commitment to reinvention needs to happen at the highest level, the actual reinvention is only possible when it happens from the bottom up inside it, because that's the real challenge of what we're trying to make happen.
Makes sense. So let me ask you, right? I want to ask you, give you an example of something that happened to me many years ago and see if that's a reasonable example to take to ask this question that I'm going to ask. In one of my first jobs in a large company, someone told me that this particular SQL query was not performing very well, so it needs to be tuned. I was a junior developer. I went to look at what it was doing, how it could be doing things better and faster. I spent my time and energy in actually improving the query, right? And so it performed better. So I was very happy. I'm like, hey, you know what? It took, I don't know, 200 milliseconds or 150 milliseconds to run this. It's now taking 20 milliseconds. I've improved it sevenfold. Krish is the best developer out there, right? So I was very proud. I take it to my lead manager, call them what you will, folks who knew a whole lot better than I did at the time. Well, the query was tuned, surely. They did not deny that. But the follow-up question was, Krish, did you check to see if this query should even be running in the first place when the user performed that particular action? Mm-hmm. I did not do that, right? Because I was told by somebody that the query was slow, and I was myopic in making that decision, and I had to tune that query. So I went and did what I did there. Now, that's the example that I want to take. And let's see if that example translates as well as I thought it would 2 minutes ago, but we'll see how it goes, right? Now, you come into this organization, they hand out a list of things saying, Nikki, here are some of the challenges we are running into. We're trying to cut costs, maybe improve efficiencies, and do yada, yada, yada. And how can you help us do that? Now, they know the business better, surely, because it's their business, like you said. You come in through the door as the home designer because you're learning about that business, but they've imposed a bias already to get started with. And if I could take the query example here, they gave you the sheet with the query that was performing poorly, and you fantastically tuned that query. But what if the query should not be run? Meaning, what if the sheet that they hand out to you was not the right sheet to begin with? Is that a problem, or am I just imagining a non-existential problem?
In that scenario, I'm the one making the change to the query, which is not the case. They're the ones making the change to the query based on the guidance that they're getting in terms of what to move towards and how to go about making that change. So the institutionalized knowledge of the business and of that company and of the reality of their working approach remains with the team that is driving that change. So it's truly, one way to think of it is, rather than thinking of it as like Deloitte driving change management, think of it as Deloitte meets Duolingo. So like, it's self-powered, it's, self-service change, because you are getting the guidance on what you need to do, but ultimately you're the expert driving the change. And what our part of the process is ensuring that using your house analogy, that it's happening within the 90-day period, that it's happening within the guardrails of what's established and the expectations of, the results that can come out of that process. But they're the ones who are choosing the color, who are deciding, what makes sense in terms of the furniture placement and testing out different scenarios of what could actually play out in real life. And that is the adoption that comes out of that, because it is not imposed externally. It is not lacking in context of the reality of business change. And it's almost like nothing to do with the technology in many ways, right? This is truly like people and cultural transformation and team operational transformation The technology is just a byproduct of what has better adoption and better implementation because the environment gets tuned appropriately for.
Okay. Two things. The easiest of the two first. Did you mention Duolingo somewhere in your response there?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you did? Okay. That's a company we trade all the time too. That's why I was like, oh, you know what? Because they have a lot of action in terms of volume and activity. Oh my
Yeah.
God. They are it is like a day trader's dream, Duolingo as a company. I was curious. Okay. But more seriously, my first question is going to be, I understand, Nikki, that you're going to, the sheet has the query on it and you're
Yeah.
not tuning the query yourself. You're providing recommendations around how the query should potentially be tuned. But my question was mainly that now you're limited to the tuning of that query without knowing what else needs to be done that's better. Is that just the way it works? Because you cannot know as much as they probably and they should know about the business. So it's not for you to go tell what should be changed. It's for you to change what they are asking you to change the best way you can possibly change it.
Yeah, I mean, look, part of the core of this is that it's not a one-time change. If you think of it as an episodic one-time change, you got to get it right the first time, right? When you think about iterative, reinvention, the primary goal is progress, not perfection. Just getting them out of not moving at all, not changing how each individual works, not changing how the teams operate, not changing how the leaders make decisions, that is the important objective, not the query itself, right? So a lot of your questions have been about like the furniture, the color. To me, that's the technical aspect, which makes sense. I mean, you're the techie here, right? The business objective here is more of what's top of mind for the CEO. Can I get my culture to shift? Can I get my people to think differently? That has almost nothing to do with what technology is deployed, whether the implementation is correct or wrong, or 30% correct, or the workflow is accurately reinvented or not. Movement and momentum is the objective. So that's why the part of that whole like 90-day sprint of getting them to feel empowered to say, I don't have someone else coming and telling me that I'm doing it wrong. I know that, okay, I have a playbook. This gives me a sandbox and guardrails within which I can experiment. And here's, what we believe are the high value use cases. And let me start working with this. And together we can figure this out following this playbook and the instructions. And let's see what the result is. Okay, well, the result was way better than we expected. Great. The result was not even close to what we were hoping for. Great. Start doing that thing again and find another way. It's building the muscle of that continuous reinvention, which is the real objective. And once they start doing that, you start to see the momentum come about and more ideas released that they had never even thought of together. The other byproduct of all of this is actually bringing teams together to focus on this. Think about in any big company, how often do teams actually come together to work on the business, not in the business? One of the common adages of founders is like work on the business, not just in the business. That doesn't happen in big companies because what they're doing is even if they meet, they're meeting for some specific functional objective, right? Like we got to launch this product or we're dealing with this customer deal or whatever. They're not actually working on the business. So in many ways, this is the opportunity for them to work on the business because that's what reinvention is. And bringing that brain power, that collective like horsepower together every week where they're focusing on it is really what releases like all of that idea, the energy and the enthusiasm and the commitment to change.
I like your usage of the term iterative reinvention because the way I saw it generally, at least before we started this conversation, was that they were mutually exclusive from each other. Either it's iterative or it's reinventing, but you put
Yeah.
them together, right? You're saying
Yeah. No, it's
iterative
continuous.
reinvention.
Yeah. Because change isn't stopping. Change is happening only faster. But like by the time they get done with one sort of improvement or one way that they reimagine, okay, we're going to start doing like marketing differently. This is the old way we used to do it. Now we've completely reinvented. Well, by the time they start adopting that, there's going to be like 5 more changes again. So that's why I said it's more about building the muscle and the operating rhythm and the cultural experimentation cycles. That is the real value, not what gets implemented, not what gets changed.
Okay. And you said a lot of what I was asking was unintentionally or intentionally just because of my experience from a technological perspective, right? But you said it's beyond that, it's also very cultural. So let's get to you can take either a real example that you worked with or a manufactured one. It doesn't matter for the purpose of this question and conversation. But what would be the smallest concrete example, just so we can understand this, digest this, and I can have a few follow up questions? What's the smallest real life example that you've seen of a problem that could have been improved transformatively, and tell us what the transformation could have potentially have been, but then in this scenario and approach you took a more a revolutionary way of methodology to fixing that same thing. So what's the example that's fair reasonable here? What would have been a transformational approach and what was the revolutionary approach?
Yeah. I don't know if I can describe it in like evolutionary versus revolutionary ways, but I'll give an example of something that would not have come to light had it been just a generic digital transformation project, right? So in this scenario, if it was your typical transformation project, it would have been like, here are the new tools that we're planning to use. It's been deployed. Everybody, we're mandating that you have to start using these new tools, right? And we expect that based on the usage of these tools, you're going to increase efficiency by 20% or what have you. It just gets forced or mandated. And then maybe there's training about the tool. Here's how to use the tool. And that's what it is. What does not get uncovered through that process is where's the mindset of the individuals when it comes to that. And so, one of the things we discovered, and this was interestingly, it was actually an engineering team. And, our hypothesis was that, well, they're engineers, they're techies. Of course, they're going to be like, there should be no issue about them embracing any new way of doing things, right? I mean, you alluded to like actually looking at what's changing and how might we do things differently before you keep doing things the old way. But our assumption was that compared to, let's say, the HR department, the engineering has got to be way more advanced and like far more open to adoption and change. What was interesting that we found out was how conditioning and beliefs get in the way of letting go of an old approach. One of the team leaders in this group basically was like, hey, I've derived my sense of worth. Like, I'm really proud of my career and the impact I have as a leader, the team I've built, and the products we've built, and all of that stuff. Because I'm a hard worker. I put in a lot of hours. I've been dedicated to this company and this team for all this time. But when I use these new ways of, building products, I feel like it's a fraction of the time I feel like I'm cheating. And because I value my team, I like hardworking people on my team. So when they use it, I feel like they're cheating, right? Now that's a values conflict. That's got nothing to do with the technology or the tool that's been deployed. If it was just digital transformation, you would deploy the tool, you'd give people training, you tell them to start using that, and you would move on. Whether it was fully adopted or whether you discovered why there was any kind of real resistance or how you might want to rethink every step of the way, you wouldn't even find that out. In this process, because of the 90-day sprint, what we discovered was uncovering that kind of like deep rooted belief systems and values conflict that then led to, okay, how do you shift your values now? How do you shift from effort equals to value to like impact equals to value? Right? What does that mean in terms of how you rewire your leadership style? Not just in leading the engineering team, but if your command and control approach has to shift to like, how do you become the chief meaning maker? How your job is now just about providing context and the why, not on like measuring people on how many hours they put in and how many lines of code that they personally wrote or all of that stuff. How do you shift your leadership behavior and mindset? And how do you value your team differently? What does that mean in terms of your daily rhythms and your routines? What does that mean in terms of your weekly team norms and the KPIs and the approaches that you have? How does all of that need to be reimagined if 80% of what you used to do now a machine can do? And then how do you reallocate not just your time, but reallocate the time that is released, the capacity that gets released from your team and put that into either increasing your throughput or taking on more, you know, products or projects, or fundamentally rethinking, you know, the what your team's like mission is about. To be able to get into something deep like that, that becomes a whole different conversation. And it not only changes the individuals, but it changes how the teams are wired and how they start operating.
So a lot of what we're talking here, correct me if I'm wrong, they are soft skills as well, right? In other words, you said culture,
Yeah.
organizations, not just technology, right? There's other things beyond that. So let's say this is where, let me ask this specifically, which is someone comes in from the outside, right, to provide opinions because we need that help.
Yeah.
Now, do you see pushback? And here's why I'm asking that
Yeah.
question, because if you go to the movie Up in the Air, I'm not sure if you've seen
Yeah.
that. It's a George, one of my favorite movies, where they hired George Clooney and the company from the outside to let go of people. And one of
Yeah.
the things that I vaguely recall from the movie, Nikki, is that one thing is the layoff in itself that people don't take very well to, understandably so. But the second part of it, just as interesting, was the fact that it was happening in a more transformative, not transformative, maybe revolutionary, I don't know, a
Mhm.
different way from where what the folks were used to, at least in the
Mm.
movie and in the story. That they didn't react very well to the fact that George Clooney happened to work for a different company, and then he hired a younger kid who did this layoff through video and whatnot, right? This is from 15 years ago,
Yeah, it was ruthless, right?
right? the
Yeah.
it's a the reason I even bring that example is one of the things is people coming from the outside to providing recommendations versus people working already in the organization providing those recommendations. So do you find sometimes, is this even a scenario where you're like, hey, we need to make these big changes because the transformational changes are not going to be helpful, but then the moment you propose these changes, people don't take to it very well necessarily because they think for whatever reason that, hey, the person coming from the outside does not know the complexities of the things that we are dealing with, so they might be able to suggest something in good intent, but just may not be something that works for us internally.
Yeah, I mean, that would be true if we were the ones recommending the changes, right? We are providing the environment and the sandbox for change, but we're not the ones recommending what to change to. They're the experts, they discover what the change is. And that's why the attitude is so different. And I mean, I've been in change management and transformation, my gosh, for 25 plus years. And it's, if there's one theme I've seen over and over again, it is the cultural resistance and the emotional and behavioral resistance to change. It's just really, really hard to drive home in any organization. And you talk to anyone in change management, that is the thing. It's not about the change you're implementing in terms of either a new process or a tool. It's always the behavioral part. The difference in the past was that even if the people took 18 to 24 months to accept the change, it was okay. Today, can you imagine in this day and age if they took 18 to 24 months to accept the change? There's no time for that, right?
It ceased
And
to
so
be in
that,
business at the time, yeah.
yeah, that is the difference. The issue is not about like the human behavior hasn't suddenly changed because of AI. Human behavior and the resistance to change is still the same, like it always has been. I've seen change happen from like brick and mortar companies embracing like needing to build an e-commerce channel, and suddenly everybody's up in arms saying, "Oh my God, we're gonna, you know, cannibalize our own stores and all of that," to like mobile to cloud. Every single one, there was so much resistance, but the environment was slow enough that it was able to create space for humans to adapt to that change at a natural pace. Today, the expectation of change and the speed at which it needs to happen is unnatural. And because of that, the forced approach of outside in recommendations kind of falls flat. That's why taking an approach of, hey, you're the expert, Krish, you know your business, you're the master of your craft. We're just going to give you the playbook of how, you know, like what changes and how change works, whether, you know, in changing a process or introducing a tool or, you know, team behaviors and all of that. Take all of this, you know, knowledge, and like you're the expert along with your teammates. Let's figure out the brainstorm of figuring out like what is the right answer, and let's come in with a few hypotheses that we test, learn, and experiment and get better at, right? So that, first of all, feels more empowering because it's not forced. Second, it puts them in a creative state rather than feeling like it's about, just an implementation. It makes them feel like they're innovating the business itself because they're working on the business, right? So there's a different kind of ownership and agency that comes about behaviorally, and those people feeling like, wow, this is like I'm getting a blank slate to like reimagine things, right? So there's an excitement that comes about that leads to blue sky ideas and innovation things that there's in a typical work environment that never gets released. So there's an excitement around that, but then also different ideas and diverse perspectives within the team lead to an answer that all of them are willing to accept, or at least try out and see, does this work or not? And if it doesn't, we'll go back to the drawing board and try something new, right? So that being able to drive that kind of change in 90 days versus 24 months, that's the real trend, like that's the real power of it, of being able to unlock that. And so it's, I would say it's not just about soft skills. More than that, it's a behavioral shift. It's a mindset shift. And the number one thing that changes in this is identity, because we all hold on to identities based on a success formula of the past. Just like the engineering lead that I was talking about, there's an identity of I'm a hard worker and I like hard workers on my team. Letting go of that is not as simple as saying, oh, I'm just going to change my KPIs and I'm going to adopt these tools. Unlearning that old way and like literally thinking of yourself differently, it's a psychological shift, not just a soft skill, training or change.
Wow, this has been a very technical conversation. You know what I mean? Very technical for me, especially for someone like me who does not understand a lot of this. Thank you so much for sort of patiently explaining this, right? We have about 10 minutes to go. I'm going to ask you one last, maybe quote unquote, a technical question. Then we can spend the rest of the minutes just having a more casual, more relaxing conversation, if you will. The last question I have there is, now you go to the company, they tell you the issues they're running into, you're working with top management, and then you start helping them make recommendations, and it's up to them to put that into practice in whatever form, way, or shape they do, right? That's the gist of what I've captured so far. Now, let me take this specific example of a couple of companies that I truly like, and a lot of us love and like those companies, right? Meta and Apple. I'm going to take two companies. Mark Zuckerberg, in one of his many interviews, he said that ideas are never fully formed. Maybe it was a commencement speech, if I'm not wrong. He says, you start with an idea, you start rolling, and you start making changes to that idea, right? Even at the highest level of a $2 trillion or $1.7 trillion company, which is amazing because that's how I've always done my entire life.
Yeah.
I've worked for startups most of my life, but it was good to know that even these large companies have that mindset, especially when you have an engineering founder who's still running the company, right? It does make a huge difference. Let's take that for a second, and I'll come back. I'll take Apple and come back to Meta. Tim Cook, great CEO. Some product, there's certain things that he does extremely well, like services and growing the company tenfold since Steve Jobs was there. But from innovation standpoint, there's still a question about how much Apple has recently been innovating, relying on Google and Gemini for Siri support. The news that came out 2 days ago tells me that maybe they fell short in some ways because they spent all their money in doing Apple Car that never came out, or Vision Pro that was like putting a brick on your head, and I thought that they were never going to do well, right? And Meta has had their own share of issues with Metaverse and the Reality Labs, where I think the $70 billion loss or more over the years. And the news came out 2 days ago, they're going to cut down on spending on VRs and go spend more time on augmented reality and other things that they can reallocate that money to. What I'm trying to say by virtue of these two examples, Nikki, is even CEOs, founding CEOs, or ones that have run the company long enough to almost be founding CEOs like Tim Cook in this example of hyperscalers, can make very human mistakes where things actually do not go their way. So the graveyard of products that never saw the light of day at Amazon or Alphabet or Apple, that's a big number, right? Startups they cease to exist because you don't have the money to build the next one. Large companies can keep failing and keep building new products, right? So ultimately, long story short, I think everybody is making mistakes, and because they're all human. So after all of that story, the backstory, my question to you is, if these large hyperscalers and company found brilliant people running these companies can make mistakes, and they have made these mistakes many a times, is it not possible that somebody comes to you with a sheet of paper saying this is what we need to improve, and somebody gives phenomenal recommendations, and then they go back and put that into practice only to know that they were wrong to begin with, right? Does that happen frequently enough, or how do you approach the problems if that were to happen?
Yeah, great examples, by the way. First of all, if you abstract the Meta and Apple example, yes, on one hand, they've made colossal mistakes that have been pretty expensive overall, and all of that. The bigger thing is that they made those bets, that they took that risk, and they kept moving forward. Momentum matters. That's the biggest thing. Matters for big companies as much as it does for startups. Startups, the moment they stop innovating and shipping, yes, you have a bigger, you keeping cash in bank for runway while not shipping doesn't make you any more valuable, any better chance of success. You're better off burning the last dollar and having something shipped that gives you a shot at being valuable and being, successful in the market. And the same is true for big companies. They just have larger reserves, and they tend to have the capacity for bigger bets. Sometimes those don't work out. Like, what was that? The Fire Phone from Amazon, and so many other bets that were, just colossal losses. The driver for all of those decisions is you cannot afford to stand still. That's the bigger thing, is you're never going to have perfect outcomes or guaranteed successes every time, but a much bigger risk is standing still. And that's really the core of even what we're solving right now, which is you cannot afford to stand still. Are you going to get everything right? Will every sprint result in 20% returns every single time? No. Will some of them lead to like mistakes that have to be course corrected quickly? Maybe there's a customer experience issue that like had good intentions, kind of like your query, but ends up having a pissed off customer. Sure, that might happen, but it's far more dangerous to do nothing and waiting for perfect conditions with total certainty and with like guaranteed successes before you start moving. So again, all of this is about momentum. Now, in our case, part of the reason why we design these sprints the way they are, they're no more than 4 teams at a time, they're no more than 90 days, is those are conditions that limit the risk exposure. That is by design. We're not doing like 10,000 people at a time with like 18-month programs with a $20 million price tag, because if something goes wrong there, your exposure is much larger. By doing it in smaller size, shorter sprints with very contained environments, limit the level of risk exposure. And it's also designed in a way where chances are things sometimes won't be perfect, but the course correction is quicker and easier. And it creates the culture of experimentation, which also includes talking about failure and correcting and learning from failures, which frankly, for any big, if you really think about stodgy industries and big companies, that is the greatest gift of all, to just be able to do that. The successes don't change the culture. The experiment, test and learn from failures, that is what really unlocks that startup and culture within a big behemoth.
You know what, Nikki, it was beautifully articulated. Everything that you just said as a response to that question, and I mean it. You said, using the very last dollar and burning it makes a lot more sense than saving the money because you're not achieving your purpose. I think you could not have said that any better. And I'll say one thing that makes sense, which is, somebody who's running a company and we have ad dollars, and we almost always have less money than the money we need actually. So there are decisions we make which are sometimes really silly and not something. Let me take the example. Let's say we place an ad for $75 on Instagram, right? Or TikTok or one of those places. I promise you, I've made these decisions more than once during the course of Snowpal's lifespan here, where there are days we're like, what, should I actually go for dinner this Friday and spend $100? Or should I put that money on an Instagram ad, right? When I started the company like so many years back, I never thought that these would be questions I would be asking off of myself, right? Those are questions I do ask of myself today. And there are numerous times where the $100 dinner does not happen and the ad happens, right? It's just because you want to spend the very last dollar in reaching your purpose. So I think what you said there hit the note for me. As we come to a
Well,
close
everything.
here, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Krish, look, this is not just a big company CEO challenge that they. I mean, if anything, they have a much bigger pool of resources, whether it's capital, connections, authority, trust, experts, advisors around them to guide their decision making. But for every founder, this is a very real, lived experience. How many of us have faced those moments where you're facing these high stakes decisions, which may feel menial to a Jamie Dimon, but for you, it's life and death, right? You're trying to figure out, like, what are the trade offs? Like, what bet do I actually make? And the level of self belief that one has to have, and also not just in making that decision, but understanding the cost of not acting. And I think we often underestimate that we think in terms of the upside, but we don't often consider what's the downside risk of doing nothing. What is the downside risk of safety? What is the downside risk of not having rapid execution and not shipping fast enough and not making that bet? Because that dinner, that will come back in spades someday. But the missed opportunity in that Friday night is probably lost forever, because that's momentum that is gone from the business.
You know what, Nikki? So I've come to my very last question. It's a non-technical question, but before that, I'm going to let you ask me anything you want to ask me. But I'll say one thing before I do that. You didn't mean it, but you unintentionally you've made life difficult for me as an Indian person and some other Indian people. And here's what I mean by that. On top of being brilliant at what you do, the way you articulate your thought process is not helping the cause for me in particular. I'll tell you why. Every time I mispronounce a word, which happens like 95 times a day, I almost pick the way to pronounce a word. And then I have to do the opposite of how I think it should sound, like what George does for other reasons in Seinfeld. And it turns out to be the right way. And my wife, who's Indian from Malaysia, she's always like, Krish, how do you possibly mispronounce everything? My only response to her is, Meena, wait till you meet some of my other friends. You'll be like, Krish is all right. They mispronounce a lot more. My only excuse generally has been it's not my native tongue. I'm not a native speaker. But when I take people like Nikki as examples, that doesn't hold. My argument doesn't hold any water. So
argument with your wife now.
Yeah, it's beautifully articulated, right? So before I ask you my non-technical question that I ask of all my guests, here's an opportunity for you to ask me anything if there's something you want to ask me.
Well, I'll ask the question that I asked before we started, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it again, which is the history you've had in your craft and your profession, and the successes or setbacks you've endured over this time. What excites you the most for the next decade, and what scares you the most for the next decade? Very personal. I'm not talking about your business. I'm not talking about engineering at large and all of that. Just personally.
Great question. I'll dish it out as it is, right? I have one set of skills, or almost one skill, which is building software, right? I don't have the luxury of having 4 other skills, right? Like if A.R. Rahman, like say the best music composer, for people who haven't checked Rahman out, please do so. But my favorite composer, he's got like 17 different skills in the space of music. Some other composers have like one singular skill. I'm the latter. I have a singular skill, which is building software. So I have nothing else to lean back on, right? Which is not comforting sometimes, but other times that makes it a whole lot more challenging, because the only skill that you do have, you have to do that to the best of your ability, right? Which is building software. So it puts a lot more pressure. And here is what I mean by that. You can build software to make things work, so the system is functional, right? Like you do it in college. But at work, it's not enough, right? In the real world, you're not going to go too far if things just work. They have to work to specification, obviously, but they have to work so they scale the test of time, both in terms of users and the growth of the company, and the soft skills of the organization as well, right? The systems that you have in place have to scale continuously, and you're going to have to make changes all the time, because things are going to change all the time. As a startup, Nikki, we generally pick up the right set of skills because we like to do those things the best way possible. But here's what excites me for the next so many years to come. Software, I think, is at, the whole world is at the point of of inflection, in my
Mhm.
opinion. So nobody's protected from the changes that are bound to come, right? But software, speaking to it as somebody who's in that business, it's going to change transformationally, meaning the way you architect software applications cannot
Mhm.
look anything like it did like 2 years ago or 1 year ago. Meaning, everybody who's had all of these skills built over the last 20 years, much like myself, you're back to the drawing board. You're back in high school. You're going to have to go back and unlearn and relearn. The
Yeah.
learning part is difficult, but not as difficult as the unlearning part, I think, that you mentioned earlier, because all of us have a sort of muscle memory. And when you
Yeah.
start writing code, you're going to write it the same way, but you
Yeah.
can't do that anymore, right? You cannot write code the same way. You don't want to do it the same way. You cannot architect applications the same way. Everything is going to have to be 180 degrees different, which is
Mhm.
super exciting in one way, because if this happened 25 years down the road, I would have retired and sat out and would have been a bystander, right? So I feel
Yeah.
privileged that I'm still in the mix of things to be able to make an impact, use it, and also contribute at the same time. So that's the exciting part. The scary part is the fact that things are changing so much and they're going to continue to change. And totally in the school of thought where AI is not hype. Jensen Huang knows a whole lot more about what he's doing than a lot of other people in the world. Because as a tech person, you start falling in love with these tech CEOs, right? Every time you see them, it's like seeing a celebrity like Scarlett Johansson or somebody, right? It's no different, to be honest. So I feel like if all of them got it right, and if they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, everyone's life is going to change. People ask me, what's going to happen to developers with AI being in the mix? What people don't ask enough is, a developer can now build software with very few other roles in the team. You never
Yeah.
have that conversation. As easy as it is to replace developers in a software company, it's my personal opinion that it's a whole lot easier to replace every other role that's outside the developer role in the very same organization, which means everybody is going to have to go back to the drawing board and see, what do I do? What am I going to do to make a living? What am I going to do things passionately so my rest of my career doesn't become boring and brain dead? And how can I enjoy the process of living the rest of my professional life by learning and doing the things that are more current? Because I totally believe that things are going to be so different exponentially in the next year, 2 and 5 and 10 years, that a lot of the roles that we know of today are going to cease to exist, like entirely, right, from the face of the earth. Which means it's scary, because what if there is going to be not an architect anymore? What is Krish going to do? What if there's not going to be a developer anymore? What is Krish going to do? What if there's not going to be a software startup anymore? What is Krish going to do, right? So
Yeah.
those are things that are exciting and scary at the same time. But to anybody who's anxious, a lot of people are, I speak to friends and family who are, this is what I tell them, right? Would you rather that this happened 25 years later? Would you rather this happen now, or would you rather this happen 25 years before? I'm pretty sure you would rather it happen 25 years before, but better late than never. That's at least happening now.
Mhm.
If you were not to have been disturbed in your thought process, it would have happened 3 decades later, and you would have
Yeah.
had no contributions to this part of what's happening. Right? At least that's the way I look at it. Hopefully, some of that makes some sense. Yeah.
Well, I have to commend you, Krish, because this was the best pitch for flip work I've ever heard. You literally described the use case for why we exist. I mean, that is literally why we exist and what we help companies do, right? Because every individual in that company, no matter what role they hold, is facing that same existential threat. Well, it's forget about just worrying about whether you're gonna get laid off. The bigger risk is, will your role and your expertise even be needed, or do you become completely obsolete and irrelevant? That's the bigger risk. And so the process of helping them through true reinvention to say, who might you now become? There are things that you have learned from what you've done in the past, because like software development, there's a pattern recognition skill. There's a skill of being able to take something that is complex and making it simple. There's lots of things that are there that can be repurposed in a new way. But really thinking of it in the context of, how do you partner with AI to become exponentially more capable? But that requires unlearning, shedding, letting go of the muscle memory, and giving yourself permission and being excited about what's new, what's ahead, that is unknown, and having that rookie day one mindset. Because if you come in as, oh, I've got 25 years of experience, I'm at the top of my game, the motivation to actually let go of your proven playbook and be willing to be humble and curious and, as if it's day one of college, it's not an easy thing to do. No matter what we say, theoretically, it sounds cool. In practical terms, that's not an easy thing for any human being to do. Right? So to be able to do that, and that's why a controlled environment, a safe environment in which you can, allow yourself to like reinvent and see a different version of yourself emerge, see a different identity, see new ways of creating value and contribution, and do that together as a team. That change creates value, and helps to amplify that human, but it also unlocks hidden potential that company could never unlock before, because now they're doing it in this agentic workforce thing, that it wasn't just about the people, it's their people becoming people squared. And when that happens, even at some point, if they cut 30% of their workforce, these are people that are now moving on with a better sense of self and reimagined capabilities versus obsolete talent that nobody wants to touch.
Best wishes to Flip Work. And you said it was a good pitch. Reminder to self, next time, Krish, try to pitch your own company as well, right? I'll tell you why, because I do these podcasts. And by the way, thank you. That was a great response as well. My wife reminds me, after that, I go tell her, and she says, Krish, did you remember to mention some of what your company does?
I'm going to ask you that. So, Krish, because so many people in my network and my audience will be viewing this content as well. So most of them may not be familiar with Snowpal. So give us your pitch. Tell us.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I'll do it in 2 minutes.
Audience and how it can be, how it can be helpful to them.
Thank you for asking that, Nikki. Much appreciated. Yeah. So we are a product company based out of the suburbs of Washington, D.C. We've been in business for several years. We have many different products. I'll start with the most recent one. We publish APIs both on AWS Marketplace and sell them as commercial licenses. So anybody else who's building software can do it in real quick time, right? They can go to market a whole lot sooner. When we built our first B2C product, like about 5 years ago, it's a project management platform, snowpal.com. We did it in quick time, but even for a team like us, it took us longer than we would have liked for it to take, because the backend systems were not in place, right? We had to build every single thing, and it took us a lot of time. And then when you talk to other founders, we recognize that building user interfaces in the front end, people could do it in much quicker time. Even before AI, with AI, you can do it in even quicker time. But getting the backend systems in place, getting them to work, thoroughly tested, functional, and scalable is not an easy proposition, right? It just is a lot harder. So we decided to reprovision our software and make them public. So if you're building any software, mobile apps, web apps, microservices, combining AI and our APIs, you can go to market a whole lot quicker with a lot less money. So you're spending your time and energy building what you're building, wanting to build, and not going to look for money, right? That's our API product. We also have the products that we build, the mobile B2C product, which is the project management platform, which is snowpal.com. Or you could download the apps from the app and play stores to manage your work and professional lives better, right? That's our example of a fully functional product that leverages our own APIs. So that our APIs are not just sitting there on AWS Marketplace with no proof. Our product is a proof in itself that you can see and check that out too, right? And last but not least, we also have an education platform which we incorporated into our products. So if you're a course creator, you can publish your courses on our platforms. You just create the content and leave the rest to us. You get to keep 80% of the revenue that your course generates, and we keep the 20% for our expenses and margins and whatnot. So those are like 4 different products, right? We have variations of these, but we are a full-fledged product company with 4 products in the B2B and B2C space. And we're a polyglot shop with like 7 different languages, I think. And the next one we're working to build, Nikki, is the fintech API I mentioned, where we're spending time in the stock market. So a lot of our recent courses have been about what it is to be in the stock market, right? What are index funds, things of that nature, right? So that's hopefully a 2 to 3 minute
So
pitch
who's
on a
your
bunch of things we
ideal
do.
audience or decision maker or buyer?
If it's a if you're buying at APIs, you're hopefully a director of engineering or a VP of engineering or a CTO of a company that's saying, you know what, I have this brilliant idea. I want to go to market soon. I have a small team, or maybe not a team that's big enough, because no matter how many people are there, it's never enough. And we don't
Mhm.
want to reinvent the wheel of building the pieces of the puzzle that have already been built and deployed and functional. So we just go build the piece that we want to build and use Snowpal for the rest of everything that we don't want to necessarily build, because that does not prove your point, right? In other words, if you're trying to showcase a cooking range in a kitchen, a lot of times you have to build the whole kitchen and you're
Yeah.
wasting time in building the kitchen, right? And in this case, you would use the Snowpal kitchen and you would just build the cooking range that you want to build and showcase to your investors, your end users, or whatnot,
Mm,
essentially.
makes total sense.
So that's our
Makes total-
business. Hopefully that, and please, if anybody in your audience is watching and listening, they can definitely hit us up. My
Snow-
last question. Yep. Our products.snowball.com, which is our homepage to our rest of our products too. My last non-technical question to you, Nikki, is what is your favorite food, comfort food?
Oh my God.
You can only
So
pick one, by the way, just one dish.
that's so hard. Um, well, I would say it's khichdi.
And you're going to have to explain that just so everybody knows. Yeah.
Yeah, so khichdi is an Indian traditional Indian dish, which is rice and lentils cooked together with minimal spices and maybe potatoes or some basic vegetables in it. But it is one of the most universal dishes across all parts of India. India is so diverse, with every region having its own type of cuisine and different spice levels and all kinds of things. But one of the most common, or I believe the most common dish across all of India that almost every community has, is khichdi. And for me, it's reminds me of my mom. And anytime that I would be sick or under the weather or just whatever, it was always like the time of khichdi.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Do you? I have a very last question. This is not a question I had in mind. And again, feel free to not answer this as well. You know what I mean? This is completely outside the podcast.
yeah,
I don't have very many Indian people on the podcast, right? You're probably the third one, if
yeah,
memory serves me right. By virtue of being somebody who's also from India, even if a different part of India. Uh, and given the context we live in, here's a question. And again, please
yeah,
feel free to not have to answer this question. Um, Immigration. Um,
yeah.
if you want to answer this question, your thoughts on being an immigrant, a legal immigrant in America, what your experience has been. If you have to say something to
Yeah.
folks watching this from the US, most of our audience is in the US who are, say, non Indian people,
Yeah.
what would it be? And if you have to say something to an Indian person, perhaps watching this in India, what would that be?
Yeah.